Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Morrison. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the Scarborough Public Library. And this is the 7th year that the library has partnered with the Camden Conference to present a series of programs leading up to the conference, which this year will be held February 20th and 21st. We're very grateful to the organization's continued financial support, which allows us to purchase materials related to each year's conference theme. A list of recommended books and films can be found on our Camden Conference page. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, Lenore Rapkin will provide information on how you can take part in this year's conference. In addition to being a member of our library's Board of Trustees, Lenore serves on the Camden Conference's Education Committee. Thanks, Lenore. Would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Catherine. I want to welcome everybody to tonight's program. I know that Susan Kaplan has a very exciting program to give you, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I just think because this is all built around the Camden Conference that I would put in a little plug for the conference. On Saturday and Sunday, the 20th and 21st of February, we'll be holding our 34th annual conference, the title of which is The Geopolitics of the Arctic, a Region in Peril. And it will deal with the many aspects of all the different things that are happening in that region, geopolitically and economically, and lots going on there. This year, because of the pandemic, the conference will be streamed right into your home, and tickets for the event are still available on the conference website, which is www.camdenconference.org. So I urge you to go and take a look at what's on there. Also on the website, you'll find really a list of the exciting presenters, beginning with our keynote speaker, who is Olafur Grissom, the former president of Iceland. He'll be followed by many speakers who will address all different aspects of the problems and issues in the Arctic. So, and this year we're happy again to welcome David Boccaccio as the host of the program, the entire program. So it should be a very exciting weekend, and I really urge all of you who can to at least look into it and try to tune in. I think you'll enjoy it. And now, Catherine, I give it over to you to introduce Susan.
Thanks, Lenore. Before I introduce our special speaker, I just want to have a few housekeeping questions. We're going to have questions through chat. So if you can use the chat function of Zoom, be sure that you write your question to everyone so that not everyone has the same question. Everyone will be able to see the questions. And I will relay the questions to our speaker. Her presentation sort of has two parts, one more on the historical aspects and one on current events in the Arctic. So she's going to pause about halfway through, and we'll ask some questions then. And then again at the end of the program. So we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Susan Kaplan, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Peary-MacMillan Arctic Museum and Arctic Study Center at Bowdoin College, to speak with you tonight on the topic Enduring Connections, Maine, the Arctic, and the Edge of the North Atlantic. Susan received her PhD from Bryn Mawr College. She is an Arctic anthropologist and archaeologist and studies prehistoric and historic Inuit cultures, the history of Arctic exploration, and material culture. She was particularly interested in Inuit responses to environmental change and contact with Western cultures. She has conducted field work in Northern Labrador, Canada, for over 35 years, while projects have also taken her to Alaska, northeastern Ellesmere Island, and Newfoundland. Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us this evening.
Greetings, and thank you for having me, inviting me to speak with you this evening. Before I get started, I'm going to first of all share my screen. So if you just bear with me for a moment. Okay, is that all visible?
Looks good.
Great. So I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk from Brunswick, Maine, which sits on Wabanaki land that was alienated from them many years ago. As we seek ways to acknowledge and bring to light that troubling history, I also encourage you, wherever you are, to acquaint yourself with the indigenous history of the lands and the waterways around which you live and work. So in this lecture, what I hope to do is explain some of Maine's historic connections to the North Atlantic and the Arctic, and also provide a snapshot of what is some aspects of what's going on in the contemporary Arctic. It's so much is happening that, of course, I can't cover it all. So I'm going to get started. This is actually my absolutely favorite view of the globe, down from above. And what you can see here is that the North Pole is at the center of the map. Now, you might think, well, what is the Arctic? Well, the Arctic is a region that does not have any fixed environmental boundaries. Some people think of it as everything north of the Arctic Circle, which you can see is that dotted circle going around this map. And the Arctic Circle is that point in the Northern Hemisphere where one day a year you experience 24 hours of darkness, and one day of the year you experience 24 hours of light. So some people use that as a boundary, but if you look at this map, you realize there are lots of Arctic lands that are south of it. So other people have tried to use temperature or tree line to define the Arctic, but in times of climate change, you realize that those boundaries are going to shift. So from my perspective, and for this talk, what's important for you to focus on here is that there's the two dominant features of the Arctic are this ocean that is surrounded by these large land masses. And we will come back to that as we proceed. Now, what has happened is that around the time of the Pleistocene, much of the Arctic and Maine were covered in ice. And as that ice receded, what's really interesting is that Native Americans immediately moved into these landscapes. And relevant to our story here are the maritime archaic, who many of you in Maine have probably heard them referred to as the red paint people. So they lived in Maine, but they also lived in Labrador. And so the map that I have shown here, that triangular shaped landscape with Rama Bay next to it, that's Labrador. And the maritime archaic lived up and down that coast. And then of course they they discovered a chert, which is called Rama. It's a sugary quartzite, and the tool that I've shown you here, you can see it's this beautiful sugary translucent grayish quartzite, very, very easy to flake. And Rama Bay is the only place that it has been found. But interestingly enough, it has been found all the way south into Massachusetts. And there are many maritime archaic sites in Maine that contain Rama chert. And so what we surmise as archaeologists is that there was some kind of long distance trade network that was moving probably Rama down the coast. And we surmise that perhaps wood and perhaps furs moving up the coast. So as early as 4,000 years ago, Maine had a connection to the Arctic. Now, throughout thousands of years, small-scale societies have lived on both sides of the North Atlantic, the American side and the European and Nordic side, having adapted to an environmentally challenging area. I've talked to paleoclimatologists who say that it is one of the most difficult parts of the world to live, because change is what is the constant in the North Atlantic. And so I've chosen this photograph to symbolize it. This is a 19th century fishery, because people from New England were going up to Labrador, where they were cod fishing. And so what you see here are fish flakes. You see these, all the white that you see here, that is cod that is drying. So people from Maine were going up to the Arctic to a fishery to earn a living. And so again, economics really was linking Maine to the far North Atlantic region. So in 1860, Professor Paul Chadbourne, who had been at Bowdoin and then was at Williams, he took students from Williams and Bowdoin College north to study the natural history and cultures of Labrador and Greenland. And a student who went with him was Alpheus Spring Packard, who was very, very taken with Labrador. So he returned to Labrador 4 years later on an expedition that included the painter William Bradford. And Packard went on to write a book called The Labrador Coast that remains an absolute classic today. But the real action in terms of science and exploration from Maine to the Arctic took place in the year 1891. Explorers and adventurers were going to far reaches of the globe, but a magazine called Goldthwaites announced a competition among colleges to see who could confirm the existence of some spectacular falls in the interior of Labrador. So Professor Leslie Lee headed north on a vessel called the Julia Decker with a bunch of Bowdoin students and alums to study nature, geography, culture of Labrador. There was one group that was called the Grand Falls contingent, and they did go into the interior of Labrador and they confirmed the existence of those falls. And everyone acted as if they had gone into this great unknown wilderness. Well, I think if anyone had asked the Innu and the Inuit, the indigenous people living in that area, they would find this rather curious because, of course, this was their hunting and trapping territory. very, very well known to local residents. But it was a time colonial, with a colonial mind, where Westerners really discounted the opinions and the knowledge of indigenous people. So here you see the motley crew of the expedition, and there you see Ernest Young, one of the lads on the expedition. He bought some sealskin clothing, and he has posed for a studio portrait in Brunswick, Maine, wearing his attire. And a number of years ago, descendants of the Young family donated that very parka to us, which was very exciting. 1891 was also the first time that Robert Peary went to the Arctic. Peary attended Portland High School and Bowdoin College, and he undertook his first expedition to the Arctic to investigate the Greenland ice cap. Eventually, he would shift his focus, and he was trying to be the first person to reach the North Pole. Now, countries were vying to get to the North Pole for a number of reasons. First of all, scientists had been studying the tides, and while some of them felt that it was all ocean, there were some people who looked at the tides and thought they suggested that there was land there. And so countries were vying to claim that land to exploit the resources that it might provide. And then, of course, people also, from a nationalistic and personal ego perspective, wanted the glory of that discovery. Now, in April 6, 1909, according to Peary's accounts, his African-American assistant, Matthew Henson, and 4 Northwest Greenlanders, and you will hear me refer to them as Inuit. Inuit means person. Inuit is just the Northwest Greenland dialect of Inuit. And these individuals, Siglu, Uta, Ukia, and Egingwa, accompanied Henson and Peary to the North Pole. They traveled by dog-drawn sleds across a frozen Arctic Ocean. And Peary said he planted a flag at the North Pole. But of course, there was no land at the North Pole, and so that flag would eventually have floated away. The result of this is that there was a huge controversy, which continues today, as to whether Peary was the first person to get to the North Pole, whether perhaps it was Matthew Henson walking ahead of him, whether that party didn't make it, or Frederick Cook, who claimed to have made it a year before, was the true discoverer of the North Pole, or whether none of them got there. That's a controversy that cannot be resolved. But to reach the North Pole, Peary spent years studying Inuit technologies and travel techniques and perfecting his equipment. He realized that Inuit had some superior methods of travel than anything that the West had developed, because they were so well adapted to the Arctic. But he also knew that he needed to get a ship as far north as possible to serve as his base of operations. But the vessels on which he had traveled all avoided the ice. They did not engage the ice. And Peary was a really audacious guy, and very inventive. I mean, and he invented everything from the camp stoves people use to designing what I'm going to talk about now, which is a ship. So if you look at the map, you will see an arrow in the northern part of Greenland, right next to Alert. And so that channel between Ellesmere Island and Northwest Greenland is called Nares Strait. Well, what Peary proposed doing is going up Davis Strait and then through Nares Strait to get a vessel as far north as possible, freeze it in, and use it as a base of operations. And I've shown you a satellite photograph of Nares Strait with Greenland to the right, Ellesmere to the left. The dark area is open water, and all that white stuff in between is ice, thick, sometimes multi-year ice. So this man proposed to take a vessel and push through that ice. And so what he did is he consulted with a naval architect, John Arbuckle, and together they designed this vessel. He raised the money for it, and he chose the McKay and Dix shipyard on Verona Island, just by Bucksport, Maine, as the shipyard to build the vessel, which came to be known as the SS Roosevelt. And so here you see it at the shipyard in the slide to the left. And once the vessel was built, it was said to have 2 times as much wood in it as a conventional vessel, because it was so heavily braced, because it was going to engage the ice. And then it was towed to the Portland Company, where the masts were installed, which is what's happening in this other photograph. The boilers were put in, and she was readied for sea. She was 184 feet long. She drew 16 feet, and she was designed to engage, ram, ride up on, and crush the ice. And so here you can see one of Peary's diagrams of the bracing, and there you see the Roosevelt. She's hard up against ice that is solid, and you see a number of men standing by her. She had both boilers as well as masts and sails in case she needed them. And in fact, during her first voyage, she certainly did need those sails. Things didn't always go smoothly. He chose as his chief engineer George Wardwell, a Bucksport man, unassuming, amazing, accomplished engineer, and it turns out a diarist. Peary writes very little about Wardwell, 1 or 2 complimentary lines, but I made contact with Wardwell's descendants and discovered that in fact they had his journals from 1905-06 and 1908-09. They lent them to me, and they have now donated them to Bowdoin College, and we are trying to figure out, we've transcribed them and are annotating them and hope to publish them. And he provides perspectives on those voyages, unlike anything that officially was written or that Peary or other diarists described. So among those accounts was the fact that once there was a point where the Roosevelt did encounter ice and could not push through it. And so Peary and Robert Bartlett, who was the captain of the ship, decided that they were going to dynamite their way through the ice, or as Bartlett said, we are going to use Mr. DuPont. And so they set charges in the ice to blast it apart and push the Roosevelt through. At one point, they set charges too close. Wardwell warned them that they were getting too close. They told him he was too nervous and to go down below deck and do whatever it was he was supposed to do. But in fact, they did set the dynamite charges too close. And everything in that engine room bounced, and pipe fittings broke, and the ship started to leak. And poor Mr. Wardwell, he and his men, they fixed everything. But from then on, this brand new ship had to have 3 pumps going at all times. And so here is the Roosevelt engaged with the ice. And then you see her on the right. She is where she finally got to, which was Cape Sheridan. And you can see that they've disgorged all kinds of things onto the ice. They had picked up Inuit from Northwest Greenland, and the Inuit also jumped off the ship and established a camp on land. And Jenny Lemoyne, the curator of the museum, and I are very interested in the story of the Inuit because they are totally ignored in the exploration literature. And so we went and did some archaeological work at Cape Sheridan. And here you see the remains of the tent rings that the Inuit used. And what we discovered between that and Wardwell's journals and our understanding of Inuit culture is that particularly the women on these expeditions really experienced tremendous amount of stress. Eventually, despite the controversy, nations lost interest in getting to the North Pole because everyone who had tried they had determined that there was no land there. So the next chapter for Maine is really involves Donald MacMillan, and MacMillan was on Peary's last expedition. The 1908-09 expedition was Peary's last, and it was MacMillan's first. Now, MacMillan, his family was from Provincetown, Mass., but he lost both his parents, and he spent his teenage years in Freeport, living with one of his sisters, and he attended Bowdoin College before becoming a school teacher. He also ran a summer camp for boys on Buston's Island and was a really amazing outdoorsman. And so one summer, Peary heard about him because MacMillan had saved the lives of a number of people in Casco Bay. And Peary thought, this is someone I should take on my expedition. So after the North Pole expedition, MacMillan continued to go to the Arctic. He had the bug. First, he explored Labrador by canoe and by a small motorboat. And then he launched an expedition in 1917 to look for Crocker Land, which was another landmass Peary and other people thought that they had seen. And again, MacMillan wanted to claim it for the United States. And in fact, some of his funding was from people who wanted rights to the coal and the minerals that they assumed were on this land. Well, Crocker Land turned out to be a mirage and is a very well-known one. However, MacMillan, who thought he was going to be in the Arctic 2 years, ended up in the Arctic for 4 years because no ship could come north to collect him and his men. So during those times, he thought long and hard, and he conceived of the schooner Bowdoin. It was a vessel built by the Hodgson Brothers shipyard here in Maine, 88 feet long, and smaller and more nimble than the Roosevelt. But like the Roosevelt, had an egg-shaped hull so that if ice started to pinch the vessel would get pushed up and sit on top of the ice. And the schooner Bowdoin served as a base of operations for MacMillan, who went to the Arctic in her over 24 times. Today, she is the flagship of the state of Maine and is part of the Maine Maritime Academy fleet. Now, departures, Bowdoin departures from Booth Bay and other places were huge events. In the 1920s and 1930s, MacMillan was an incredibly famous individual in this state and in other parts of the country. And so people had the Arctic on their mind. In addition to exploration, MacMillan helped pioneer radio communication from the Arctic, working in collaboration with Eugene MacDonald, who was head of Zenith Radio. He worked with Richard Byrd, although they did not get along. These two men did not like each other, but the military put them together. To investigate the capacity of flying planes in the Arctic. And those of you who get a little nervous about runways, look at that runway that they built in Northwest Greenland for their planes. He also was a very early user of motion picture cameras and film. And sometimes adapting them so that instead of a rifle, he would be hunting with a camera. And he traveled throughout the nation and Maine, giving lectures, sometimes 2 and 3 lectures a day. This is the way he was earning a living and getting money so that he could continue going on these expeditions. But as I say, he was very famous, and people's views of the Arctic were very much shaped by a lot of his film footage. And what's interesting is that he was filming at the same time as Robert Flaherty was making Nanook of the North. Nanook of the North is a film that's completely staged, and MacMillan shot what he saw in front of him. So if an Inuit was wearing Western clothes, MacMillan did not ask him to change out of those clothes. So they're really, really interesting, important films, and we have many of them and have digitized them, and you can watch them on our website. He also pioneered the use of the snowmobile in Labrador. Here, a Model T Ford equipped with skis, and you can see one at the Owl's Head Museum as well. When he was finished with it, it didn't work super well. When he was finished with it, he gave it to an Inuit in Labrador who eventually abandoned it, and some archaeologists found it, and it has now been refurbished. It has been taken to the community of Nain, Labrador, and it runs on special occasions. MacMillan also took a lot of scientists with him, and notably a lot of ornithologists, including Otto Gross, who was from Maine and did a great deal of ornithology. And so people don't realize it, but MacMillan was very influential in terms of giving scientists platforms on which they could do their work. He also got people throughout Maine and New England involved in philanthropic work in the Arctic. In particular, what I'm highlighting here was that MacMillan and his wife, Miriam, were supporting a Moravian missionary school in Nain, Labrador, now Nunatsiavut. And so what MacMillan did was a lot of fundraising and looking for donations and money to provide clothing, supplies, and toys to the children. So he took a scientific building that he had used that was a number of fjords down, and actually had it moved to the community to serve as the original schoolhouse. Now, that school is now seen with some controversy because the missionaries were trying to basically strip the Inuit of their culture and westernize them. And so in Labrador, as in many other parts of Canada, there has been truth and reconciliation, and the Canadian government has actually apologized for the residential school experience they put Indigenous people through. So later in his life, his work focused a lot on taking students north, many of them from Maine. He also was involved with the Grenfell mission. And so there are a lot of doctors that I've met in Maine who cut their teeth with the Grenfell medical mission in southern Labrador. And finally, during World War II, he was the individual that the US government turned to pick the locations for bases as convoys went from places like Portsmouth across to Europe. They would stop in Greenland, and the same with airplanes. So I'm going to stop here. What you can see is that Maine is tied to the Arctic through science, at this point, exploration, technological innovation, and education. So let's take a breather here and just see, are there any questions? You're muted, Catherine.
Sorry. We have a question. Did MacMillan realize that these missionary schools had this impact of erasing Inuit, is that how you pronounce it, culture? Was he supportive of Inuit culture?
So it's a complex answer. I think that he was absolutely he was supportive of the missionaries. And when you listen to his narratives of his films, from today's perspective, a lot of times you may feel yourself cringing because there is a sense of patronizing. On the other hand, he also really respected individuals, and they respected him. And one of the things, I should have included it, but he took portraits of people. He would come back to the coast year after year, and he would figure out, or people would tell him what they needed, and he would bring them things that they needed. He would move them locations. And in these portraits, they are totally relaxed. They are very trusting of him. And today, when I go to Labrador and Jenny goes to Greenland, people speak of MacMillan in very friendly, positive terms. Perhaps not so much the Moravians, but so I think that he was being as supportive as he could. I don't think he really understood the ramifications of what he was supporting.
Does anyone else have any questions about the more historical exploration of with Peary and MacMillan for Susan? I'm sure at the end, if you do think of something on this historical part, we can go back to it as well. But
yeah. So I want to go back to an Arctic map. So what I've talked about is a lot of activity where people they're looking at science, sort of the geography of the Arctic, the science. They're also exoticizing the area. But the fact that there was no land at the North Pole meant, and that the Arctic Ocean was largely frozen and dangerous, nations lost interest in the Arctic, except during World War II, when particularly the North Atlantic was an arena of a lot of German activity. The Germans established an unmanned weather station on the Labrador coast, and they had manned weather stations in Greenland. And then during the Cold War, there was also a tension in the Arctic because there were all these missile early warning systems put up as the United States and the Soviet Union were staring each other down. But, otherwise, people were not that interested in the Arctic. And yet today, there is so much interest, and a lot of it has to do with the transformation of the Arctic Ocean due to global warming. So the Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado, they track, among other things, they track the extent of sea ice covering the Arctic Ocean. And September of every year is very important because in September is the point when the warm season in the Arctic ends and ice starts forming in the Arctic Ocean again. So it's usually in September that they grab this snapshot of how much ice is covering the Arctic Ocean. And so this is sea ice extent map from September 2020. And the white part is where sea ice lingered in the Arctic Ocean. The blue is where there was basically open water. And what I want to call your attention to is that sort of orange-pink line, which is the median ice edge between 1981 and 2010. And if you look at the difference between that line and what you see in terms of the sea ice extent, you can see how much less coverage there is of the Arctic Ocean. But ice coverage is not the only story that should alarm us here. The other is thickness. So when Peary went north, he was traversing ice that was really old and thick. It had circulated in the Arctic Ocean year after year after year. We have now lost most of that old ice. The pans of ice are much thinner, and they are more susceptible to being broken up by strong currents and winds and storminess, and there's increased storminess in the Arctic. So places are losing not only ice cover, but that stable ice is also disappearing. And that then reveals this darker water, which again, the albedo effect is the sun hitting a white surface and you know that it bounces away. Whereas when the sun hits a dark surface, it absorbs that heat. And so we are now in the situation where we are losing ice cover, and the ice is just not surviving year after year. So it's very new, thin ice. But the problem of warming is also taking place on land, where there's land that has been in permafrost. It has been frozen for thousands of years, and many Arctic villages, particularly in Alaska, are built on permafrost. There are settlements where we can look back at that they have archaeology sites right next door to them where people have been living on these permafrost surfaces for thousands of years. Now that that permafrost is melting, what happens is the land turns almost like jello. And then when you get a storm surge hitting it, it just completely washes out. But besides that, it's unstable. And so people are losing their houses. Infrastructure, piping is being broken. But besides that, the permafrost also served as sort of a catchment so that water in lakes would not drain. And now that the permafrost is melting, a lot of lake water is draining and communities are losing their fresh water. So with this opening of the Arctic Ocean, countries that really had no interest in the Arctic have sort of gone, oh, okay, wait a minute. We can now extract oil and gas from below the sea the seabed. So the fact that there isn't land here, well, okay, but there are still resources to go after. And so who has rights to extract resources from waters that are international waters in the Arctic Ocean? And this is where the Law of the Sea Convention comes in. And it has said that countries can chart the extension of their continental shelves, and based on that chart can submit claims to have rights to exploit sections of the ocean beyond the exclusive economic zone. And I think Camden Conference people will be talking about this a lot. Countries have to submit their claims, and there are already conflicting claims submitted by a number of the 8 Arctic countries that can do this. Also, Canada has set in some protections in their waters because because fish are migrating, and there is concern that a new fishery would develop, and the Canadians have said maybe we should study the fishery, the fish and ecosystem before we exploit it and do damage to it. But besides the 8 Arctic nations that are interested, the rest of the world is interested, not only in exploiting those resources, but in the fact that the Arctic Ocean is opening up. And there are a growing number of vessels that are now moving between the Atlantic and the Pacific by way of the Arctic Ocean. Since the Russian side of the Arctic Ocean is the one that's most predictably open, this northern sea route is where most of the ship traffic is going. Between 2019 and 2020, there were twice as many transits. It went from 30 to 62 transits involving 331 vessels using that northern sea route, and they were moving raw materials and finished goods. And doing this cuts weeks of travel between Asia and the Nordic countries in Europe and the coasts of America. So this brings us back to the story of Maine, because if you look at this map, you will see that Portland, Maine is the northernmost US port on the East Coast. that might benefit from all of this ship commerce. And so port facilities are being improved. Law practices have added Arctic law specialists to their teams as they prepare for this new traffic. In addition, Eimskip, which is an Icelandic shipping company, has moved its headquarters to Portland, Maine, and really has prompted a lot of the revitalization of the International Marine Terminal. The Maine North Atlantic Development Office, Monado, has been really active in terms of promoting commerce on behalf of Maine companies. And so already many of you have probably seen Eimskip ships and containers in Portland. So this is active commerce that is taking place now. And it has also prompted other developments. For instance, University of Southern Maine has developed educational relationships with Iceland. Eimskip has traditionally allowed an artist to go on board, and so there are now all kinds of artistic exchanges between Maine and Iceland taking place. So that people are all excited about, but let's stop and realize that there are some real downsides here. All that shipping through the Arctic Ocean is increasing pollution in the region. And that global traffic is not benefiting the residents of the Arctic. They are assuming all the risk, not if there is an accident, but when there is an accident, because they are going to be the first responders. There's very little infrastructure in this area. Plus, these are really fragile ecosystems that, and for instance, oil cleanup in Arctic waters is extremely difficult to accomplish. But if you look at the map to the left, you see that there are all of these resources that now that the Arctic is ocean, people are eager to exploit beyond oil and gas. One of the things is, there are some, precious, there are diamonds, there are precious elements that are very rare and people want to go after them. However, what I want you to see is that there are also ecological ramifications for this. It imperils the wildlife of the Arctic. And so here, what I've shown is a distribution of walrus. Walrus already are having a difficult time because they are an ice-dependent animal, an animal that climbs out onto the ice. And so, for instance, in the Bering Strait, if you look at, you realize the Bering Strait is a choke point. It's a very, very narrow strait between Alaska and Russia. And yet any ship transiting the Arctic Ocean in either direction has to go through the Bering Strait. So you've got that ship traffic, and then you have marine mammal traffic, bowhead whales, walrus. I could show you polar bears, seals. And what you realize is that the Bering Strait is a really, really busy place. And on top of that, in Inupiat, Inuit, who are Eskimos, who are whale hunters, seal hunters, beluga, walrus hunters, they hunt in that strait. So imagine being in a tiny umiak pursuing an animal, and suddenly you have these huge ice breakers and you have these container ships coming at you. It's a very, very dangerous situation. Now, when Shell Oil was exploiting uh, in this area, they actually equipped the Inuit hunters with radios so that they could communicate with Shell Oil ships. But at this point, there are so many ships from so many countries coming through here that it's not a practical solution. So there is an organization called the Alaska Marine Mammal Commission, and it is made up of whaling captains, walrus hunters, polar bear hunters, beluga and seal hunters. And they came to Maine, they came to Bowdoin College, funded by Oak Foundation. And they spent they spent about a week here working out a recommendation to the US government about how to share the Arctic Ocean because of the problems with this choke point. So the Arctic now is in this very new era because the Greenlandic, Canadian, Alaskan, and Sami indigenous groups have won back some of their autonomy, but they are also called the permanent participants in the Arctic Council. The member states are the 8 Arctic nations that you see here. And then the permanent participants, which also include the indigenous people of Russia, of which there are dozens and dozens of groups, they have a place at the table. So the Arctic Council is a fascinating organization in that while the indigenous people don't have as much power as the member states, they are at the table. And so the Arctic Council, given all the activity going on in Maine, the Arctic Council did meet in Portland, Maine. Some of you may have seen the I Am Inuit posters that we hung around. And they were hosted by many organizations in Maine that banded together. There were working groups, as well as we held a big reception for them in the buildings that were the Portland company, to bring you full circle in that regard. And a number of other organizations. There's been a meeting at Bowdoin. We collaborated with the US Coast Guard Academy and brought Coast Guards from all over the world where they are handling choke points to see what kinds of recommendations there could be for how to manage the Bering Strait region. So I have 2 more slides for you to bring you full circle. In the Arctic Museum, there is a kayak, and it has been on view since the time it opened. When I came, I looked for documentation about who collected it. People said, oh, it must have been Macmillan, but we could find no documentation that Macmillan collected it. And we knew it was from Labrador or Baffin, but nothing else. And then I was looking through some historic photographs of Bowdoin College in years past. They had something called a Cabinet of Curiosity, where they had samples of rocks and taxidermy birds and things like that. And suddenly my eye went to the lower left corner of the photograph, and I realized that I was looking at the bow of a kayak. And as I looked at it, I could see that it had a very distinctive seam line that had a curve to it. And I immediately recognized that seam line. So here is this kayak. It's on the wall, and you can see that distinctive seam line on the right, that it has a slight curve to it. And we knew the photograph was taken in the 1890s. And so what we immediately did was go to Leslie Lee's journals of his expedition to Labrador with students. And we found an account of purchasing a kayak. And so we are pretty certain that this is the kayak from that expedition. Well, the photograph to your right, the gentleman that is not wearing a hat, that is Noah Noshagak. He is an Inuit from Labrador. He works for the Nunatsiavut government, which is the self-rule government there. And he is an expert kayaker and kayak maker. And so we brought him to Bowdoin, and he and Fred Randall, who is also a kayak maker, they built a replica of that kayak, and you see the frame in the photograph to the left. Now, Noah has been doing this. What he is doing is he's reintroducing the art of making and using kayaks in Labrador to increase food security so that young people who may not have enough money for an outboard motor or a snowmobile can in fact get out on the land and go hunting, increasing the food security for their families. They can get back to some of the activities of their roots. They can learn more about their landscape and also gain confidence. We are going to go post-COVID, I hope at some point. We are actually going to join Noah in Maine and help Inuit youth build a replica of this kayak, which the plans are that it will be covered and will be used. What you see here is that connections and traditions that go back in from the 1890s, these connections continue today. They endure and they change, but they're exciting. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
We have a question here about tourism. Our earlier speaker, Peter Ralston, who was a photographer, you probably know him, was talking a little bit about the emergence of tourism in the Arctic due to the opening water. As an archaeologist, do you have any, what are your thoughts, an anthropologist, on this possible future of tourism there? Do you see any advantages for the people?
So there certainly are some advantages for people in that, you know, you have people who are making things, they're making soapstone carvings, they're doing prints, there's absolutely wonderful artwork that they're doing. They also can serve as guides. So certainly, one of the things you have to understand about the contemporary Arctic is that to live a traditional hunting life, you need money, because people do use rifles, they do use outboard motors, they do use snowmobiles. And so someone in your extended family needs to earn money. And so certainly tourism is one way to get that. On the other hand, you know, more pleasure boats and tourism that comes in, there is the pollution. There's also, as I had mentioned, the danger of if something goes wrong, some of these large tour boats have more people on them than live in a village community. And so they can absolutely swamp the resources of an area. And then also, what you have to realize is that, you know, this gaze, you know, what are you doing? What is the attitude? What is the benefit to the community and the individuals the tourists are coming to visit. And so these are questions. There are ways you can work things out so that they're of mutual benefit to everybody, but they need to be worked out.
Okay. And we had a question about the Bering Strait. Who's controlling that area? Is it Russia and US, or is it an international waters?
So it is an international waterway because it's a major transit between two oceans. But the US and Russia do have major interests in that water. And when the gathering of Coast Guard people were here, there were some Russian Coast Guard people, and they and the American side, they got together and started to work out some search and rescue mutual aid understandings. Now, exactly where that sits now between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, I don't know. And certainly people, political scientists at the Camden Conference can certainly answer that question. So there is collaboration that goes on, but you can see sort of the added complexity of that part of the world.
Okay. We were talking a little bit before we went on air about the museum, how it's currently closed to the public, but people are welcome to go on to the website, or a lot of the not displays. The word museum word is escaping me here, but
Exhibits.
exhibits. Sorry, thank you. Are the exhibits all up there for people to see?
Many of them are up, and we certainly encourage you to visit them. We also have digitized quite a bit of Macmillan film footage, which you can watch. And we also have all kinds of programs for children and families, projects that we hope you will look at. And I would also like to add that a number of years ago, we had our students put together something called Maine's Arctic Trail Map, which in fact you can search for it on the web. And it will take you, what we did was spotlight important places with Arctic connections throughout the state, from the south to the north and the interior, from sort of historically important places to environments that have Arctic characteristics. So that is another resource that I encourage people to look at if you want to go on a driving tour of Maine and the Arctic. It's there for you to consult.
Well, thank you, Susan, so much for your presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I've lived in Maine most of my life, but I need to study up on both Peary and MacMillan, and Matthew Henson as well. And we do have books here at the library, some very antique books from right around that period on them, and then newer research as well. So I hope that everyone will look into that and look into the resources that are on the Camden Conference page and also our events page. There's lots of books listed there and movies as well. We have a film resource canopy here at the library where there are a lot of documentaries on the Arctic. And we also want to welcome people to hopefully return for our final program in the Camden Conference Series. That's going to take place next Wednesday, February 3rd, again at 6:30. Scarborough resident Matt Ward, who's a retired Foreign Service officer, will discuss China's historical and current interests in the Arctic region. And if you missed our first program a couple of weeks ago, which was really wonderful, photographer Peter Ralston had a wonderful display of his photographs, which were beautiful, but also showed a lot of the ice melting because he's gone back so many times. He could see how much ice has melted and the glaciers have been reduced. So please take a look at that. And then this program will get up on our website in a couple of days as well. So thanks again, Susan, for joining us this evening, and we hope you have a return to normal soon. You're teaching at Bowdoin and things, the museum can open back up again and we can all go up there and see the exhibits in person.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience for taking an evening and spending it with me. And I will just have Peary and Henson bid you goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.